I was adjusting the napkins on the buffet table when my 7-year-old son, Ethan, grabbed my sleeve with both hands and whispered urgently, "Mom, look under the table now." And when I crouched down to humor him, I saw my husband Mark's phone screen glowing in the darkness, open to a text conversation that made my blood run cold. "Can't wait to have you all to myself once the old lady's gone. The life insurance will set us up perfectly." The basement rec room of Grandma Helen's house in suburban Michigan was packed with relatives I hadn't seen in months, all gathered for her 75th birthday celebration on this gray November afternoon. The smell of her famous pot roast filled the air, mixing with the sound of my uncle's booming laugh and my cousin's kids shrieking as they chased each other between folding chairs. Mark had been acting perfectly normal all day, helping carry presents from the car, complimenting my mother on the decorations, playing the devoted husband and son-in-law he'd always seemed to be during our 9 years of marriage. I'd noticed him checking his phone more than usual, but I'd blamed it on work stress. He'd recently taken on a big project at the engineering firm where he worked as a senior analyst. The text conversation I was reading under that table, hidden in the shadows while birthday candles flickered on the cake just feet away, belonged to a man I didn't recognize. The messages went back weeks, filled with discussions about Grandma Helen's deteriorating health, her substantial estate, and detailed plans about how Mark and someone named Jennifer would start their new life together once the obstacle was removed. My hands shook as I scrolled up, seeing messages that casually discussed ways to stress an elderly woman with a heart condition, suggestions about switching her medications, talk about making sure she didn't update her, well, that currently listed Mark and me as secondary beneficiaries after my mother. If you're finding this story gripping, help this channel grow by hitting that subscribe button. We're working toward 1,000 subscribers, and your support means everything to this community we're building together. I stayed crouched under that table longer than I should have, my knees pressed against the cold linoleum floor, reading message after message that detailed a conspiracy to essentially murder my grandmother for money. Ethan had crawled under there to retrieve a toy car and spotted the phone Mark had apparently set down carelessly when he went to the bathroom. My son, who could barely read full sentences, had seen enough words like grandma and money to know something was wrong. He had that instinct kids have, that ability to sense when adults are being bad even if they don't understand the specifics. When I finally emerged, my face must have been pale because my mother immediately asked if I was feeling all right. I mumbled something about the heat and too much food, then excused myself to the bathroom upstairs, clutching Mark's phone in my sweating palm. I locked the door and sat on the edge of the bathtub, forcing myself to breathe slowly while I read through the entire conversation more carefully. Jennifer Turner was Mark's colleague, a woman I'd met exactly once at a company holiday party 2 years ago, someone I'd thought nothing of when Mark mentioned working late with her on various projects. The messages revealed they'd been having an affair for 18 months. They'd been careful, meeting at hotels during business trips, using burner phones for most of their communication, but Mark had gotten sloppy lately, using his regular phone because he thought he was being careful enough. The discussion about Grandma Helen had started about 2 months ago, right after she'd mentioned during Sunday dinner that she was thinking about setting up a trust fund for Ethan's college education. Mark had apparently done the math and realized that if Helen died before making major changes to her estate, and if my mother somehow was out of the picture or contested for being an inadequate caregiver, he and I would inherit a substantial portion of her assets, including the paid-off house in Ann Arbor and her investment portfolio that she'd carefully built over decades of frugal living and smart decisions. The truly chilling part was how casually they discussed it. There was no dramatic villain monologue, just practical planning that treated my grandmother's life as an inconvenient obstacle to their happiness. Jennifer sent articles about how stress could trigger cardiac events in elderly patients. Mark responded with observations about Helen's medication schedule and how easy it would be to accidentally cause interactions. They joked about it, used laughing emojis, treated the planned death of a 75-year-old woman like it was a minor logistical challenge in their path to suburban bliss. I heard Mark's voice calling my name downstairs, asking if I was okay. I flushed the toilet for effect, ran the water, and stared at my reflection in the mirror above the sink. My face looked strange to me, like I was seeing a different person, someone whose entire life had just been revealed as a carefully constructed lie. 9 years of marriage, a child together, a mortgage, vacation photos, anniversary dinners, all of it suddenly felt like a stage play where I'd been the only one who didn't know we were acting. Your subscription really helps us reach more people with these stories. Click that subscribe button and join us on the path to 1,000 subscribers. It only takes a second and means so much. When I came back downstairs, Mark was helping Grandma Helen cut her birthday cake, his arm around her shoulders, smiling for the photos my aunt was taking. He looked so normal, so familiar in his blue sweater and khakis, the same outfit I'd helped him pick out that morning. Ethan was watching me with worried eyes from across the room, clutching his toy car. I gave him a small smile and a nod, trying to tell him without words that everything would be okay, even though I had no idea if that was true. I couldn't confront Mark there, not at Grandma's birthday party, not with 30 relatives crowded into that basement rec room eating cake and singing old songs. Instead, I excused myself again, this time going out to our car in the driveway. The November air was sharp and cold, frost already forming on the windshields of parked vehicles lining the quiet residential street. I sat in the passenger seat and used Mark's phone to forward all the incriminating messages to my own number, then to my personal email, then to a cloud storage account I created on the spot. I screenshotted everything, backed it up multiple ways, made sure that even if he realized I had the evidence and tried to delete it, I'd have copies he couldn't touch. Then I did something that surprised even me. I called my Uncle Frank, who'd retired from the Detroit Police Department 5 years earlier after 30 years on the force. He was still inside at the party, and I watched through the car window as he checked his phone, saw my message saying, "Emergency, need to talk privately now," and made his way outside. Frank had always been my favorite uncle, the one who taught me to ride a bike, who helped me move into my college dorm, who walked me down the aisle at my wedding after my father passed away when I was 19. I showed him everything. He stood in the driveway reading Mark's phone, his weathered face growing harder with each swipe of his finger across the screen. When he finished, he looked at me with an expression I'd never seen before, something between rage and profound sadness. "This is conspiracy to commit murder," he said quietly. "Maybe it's just talk, maybe they never would have actually done anything, but the intent is here, documented, detailed. We need to call this in." We talked for 20 minutes in that freezing driveway while the party continued inside. Frank explained my options, the legal ramifications, what would happen if we involved the police now versus waiting to gather more evidence. He made calls to colleagues still on the force, spoke in quiet tones about probable cause and protective measures. We decided on a plan. I would go back inside, act completely normal, and we'd let Mark think nothing was wrong while the authorities built a case. Frank would personally make sure Grandma Helen was protected, staying with her for the next few days under the guise of helping her with some home repairs. Walking back into that party was one of the hardest things I've ever done. Mark smiled at me, asked again if I was feeling better, put his arm around my waist while we watched Grandma Helen open her presents. She unwrapped a beautiful cashmere shawl from my mother, a book of crossword puzzles from my cousin, a framed photo of all her grandchildren from my aunt. She looked so happy, so vibrant despite her age, laughing at jokes and telling stories about when she was young. The idea that someone had been plotting to cut that life short, to silence that laugh forever, made me feel physically sick. Press that subscribe button if you want to see how this story ends. We're building something special here, and you can be part of it by joining our community. Help us hit 1,000 subscribers. Ethan stayed close to me for the rest of the party, sensing somehow that the adults around him were dealing with something serious. Kids are perceptive that way. They can feel the tension in a room even when everyone's trying to hide it. When Mark suggested we should probably head home since Ethan had school the next day, I agreed with a smile that felt like it might crack my face. We said our goodbyes, hugged Grandma Helen extra tight, promised to visit again soon. The drive home to our house in Dearborn was surreal. Mark drove while I sat in the passenger seat, the same seat where I'd sat thousands of times during our marriage, and listened to him talk about how nice the party had been, how good Grandma looked, how Ethan was growing up so fast. He reached over to hold my hand at a stoplight, and I let him, Feeling the warmth of his palm against mine while inside, I felt nothing but cold calculation. This man I'd shared a bed with, made a child with, planned a future with, was a stranger who'd been willing to kill for money and lust. When we got home, I went through the motions of our normal Sunday evening routine. Bath time for Ethan, bedtime stories, tucking him in with his favorite stuffed dinosaur. Mark watched football in the living room while I cleaned up the kitchen, loading the dishwasher and wiping down counters like I had hundreds of times before. Everything looked exactly the same as it had 24 hours earlier, but everything had changed completely. That night, lying in bed next to Mark while he snored softly, I stared at the ceiling and thought about all the signs I might have missed. Had there been clues I'd ignored? Late nights at work that were actually hotel rooms with Jennifer? Business trips that included romantic dinners and shared beds? I'd been so trusting, so secure in our relationship, that I never questioned any of it. Mark was a good liar, I realized, or maybe I'd just been a willing fool. The investigation moved quickly once Frank's former colleagues got involved. They obtained warrants for Mark's phone records, his emails, his financial statements. They discovered he'd been researching Helen's medications, visiting websites about heart conditions and stroke risks, even consulting with a pharmacist friend about potential drug interactions. Jennifer's messages were equally damning, showing premeditation and specific planning. Within a week, detectives contacted me officially, and I had to give a formal statement about finding the messages, about Ethan's role in discovering the phone. Join us by subscribing. Your support helps us grow and create more content. We're almost at 1,000 subscribers, and every new member matters. Click that button now. Mark was arrested at his office on a Thursday morning. I wasn't there, but his colleague Tom called me to say that police had walked in during a meeting and taken him away in handcuffs. The charges were conspiracy to commit murder, attempted fraud, and several other counts I didn't fully understand. Jennifer was arrested the same day at her apartment. The story made the local news that evening. Local engineer charged in plot to kill wife's grandmother for inheritance. My phone exploded with calls and messages. Relatives I talked to at the birthday party just days earlier were shocked, horrified, apologetic for not seeing something wrong. Friends wanted to know if I was okay, if Ethan was safe, if I needed anything. My mother drove over immediately and held me while I cried for the first time since finding those messages. I'd been so focused on staying calm, on helping build the case, on protecting Grandma Helen, that I hadn't let myself feel the betrayal, the loss, the sheer terror of realizing I'd been sleeping next to someone capable of planning murder. The legal process dragged on for months. Mark's lawyer tried various defenses. The messages were just fantasy talk, dark jokes taken out of context. He never would have actually done anything. But the prosecution had too much evidence, the research history, the specific planning, the clear intent. Jennifer tried to claim Mark had manipulated her, that she was just going along with his ideas, but her messages showed equal enthusiasm and initiative. Grandma Helen took the news harder than anyone. She'd always liked Mark, treated him like the grandson she never had, included him in family events and holidays. Learning that he'd been planning her death devastated her. She stopped eating properly for a while, seemed to lose some of her spark. But she was tougher than she looked, that generation that survived the Depression and World War II and raised families through economic hardship. She started seeing a therapist, joined a support group for victims of family crimes, and slowly rebuilt her sense of security. I filed for divorce immediately. There was no question of reconciliation, no moment of doubt or weakness. Mark sent me letters from jail, long rambling explanations that tried to justify or minimize what he'd done, but I never read past the first few sentences before throwing them away. Whatever we'd had, whatever I'd thought we had, was gone completely. He'd killed it as surely as he'd planned to kill my grandmother. If this story is keeping you engaged, show your support by subscribing. We're working hard to reach 1,000 subscribers, and you're an essential part of that journey. Hit that subscribe button right now. The hardest part was explaining it to Ethan. How do you tell a 7-year-old that his father planned to hurt his great-grandmother? That the man who read him bedtime stories and taught him to throw a baseball was capable of terrible things? I worked with a child psychologist who specialized in family trauma, and together we found age-appropriate ways to help Ethan understand that sometimes adults make very bad choices, that it wasn't his fault for finding the phone or telling me about it, that being brave and doing the right thing mattered even when it was hard. Ethan struggled with it. He had nightmares for months, became clingy and anxious, worried that other people in his life might secretly be bad. We did play therapy, art therapy, regular counseling sessions. Slowly, with support and consistency, he started to heal. He began to understand that what he'd done, alerting me to that phone under the table, had potentially saved his great-grandmother's life. That gave him a sense of pride that helped counteract the guilt and confusion. The trial happened almost a year after that birthday party. I testified about finding the messages, about the events of that day. Ethan didn't have to testify, thank God, but his discovery of the phone was part of the evidence presented. Mark and Jennifer both received lengthy sentences, 15 years for Mark, 12 for Jennifer. They'd serve them in separate facilities. Their dream of being together forever transformed into over a decade of prison cells and regret. After the trial, life slowly found a new normal. I sold our house in Dearborn, unable to live in a place that reminded me of Mark everywhere I looked. Ethan and I moved into a smaller place closer to my mother and Grandma Helen. I changed jobs, wanting a fresh start away from people who knew about the scandal. We built new routines, new traditions, new memories that weren't tainted by betrayal. Grandma Helen thrived, ironically. The near miss with death seemed to give her new appreciation for life. She took up painting, joined a book club, started volunteering at a local community center. She never married after my grandfather died 20 years earlier, but she had a full life, surrounded by family and friends who genuinely loved her. She told me once that she felt guilty for what had happened, for somehow being the catalyst for Mark's terrible plans, but I reminded her that the only person responsible for Mark's actions was Mark himself. Subscribe to be part of our growing community. We're on our way to 1,000 subscribers, and your click makes a real difference. Join us by hitting that subscribe button. I struggled with trust for a long time after everything happened. Dating seemed impossible when I couldn't shake the fear that anyone I met might be hiding dark secrets. I went to therapy myself, worked through the trauma of betrayal, learned to recognize that Mark's actions didn't mean everyone was untrustworthy. It took years, but eventually I started to open up again, to consider that maybe not everyone was a monster in disguise. The money Mark had wanted so badly never materialized for him, obviously. Grandma Helen updated her will with the help of an estate attorney, creating a trust for Ethan's future that couldn't be touched by anyone else. She set up charitable donations to organizations that supported elderly abuse victims and family crime prevention. She made sure that even after she eventually passed, years later at the age of 82, her legacy would be about helping others, not about being a victim of a greedy son-in-law scheme. Ethan grew up carrying the weight of what happened, but also the knowledge that his quick thinking and bravery had made a real difference. He became interested in law enforcement as a teenager, inspired by Uncle Frank and the detectives who'd taken the case seriously. He understood from a young age that the world contained both good and evil, and that ordinary people had the power to choose which side they'd support. I learned things about myself through that ordeal that I might never have discovered otherwise. I learned I was stronger than I'd thought, capable of functioning under pressure, able to make hard decisions when necessary. I learned that trust was valuable precisely because it could be broken, that love meant vulnerability, and that betrayal, as painful as it was, didn't have to destroy you. I learned that family, real family that cares about each other's well-being, was worth fighting for and protecting. Looking back on that November afternoon, I sometimes wonder what would have happened if Ethan hadn't crawled under that table. Would Mark have eventually acted on his plans? Would Jennifer have talked him out of it or encouraged him further? Would Grandma Helen have died under suspicious circumstances that no one could quite prove were murder? The what-ifs kept me awake some nights, but mostly I tried to focus on what actually happened. A 7-year-old's innocent action had exposed a terrible plot and potentially saved a life. We're building something meaningful here, and your subscription helps us continue. Join our community by clicking subscribe. We're so close to 1,000 subscribers, and you can help us get there. The betrayal Mark committed wasn't just against Grandma Helen, or even against me. It was against our son, against the family we'd built, against every shared moment and promised future. He'd been willing to destroy all of it for money and a relationship with another woman. That kind of selfishness, that depth of deception, was hard to comprehend even years later. I had to accept that maybe I'd never fully understand how someone could make those choices. But I also learned about resilience. Grandma Helen's strength in recovering from the betrayal inspired everyone around her. My mother's immediate support and unconditional love reminded me that some family bonds were truly unbreakable. Uncle Frank's quick action and professional expertise showed me that having people you could depend on in a crisis made all the difference. And Ethan's recovery, his ability to process trauma and come out the other side still capable of trust and love, gave me hope that we'd both be okay eventually. The story made local news at various points: the arrest, the trial, the sentencing. Some reporters wanted to interview me to get the wife's perspective on discovering her husband's murder plot. I declined every request. This wasn't a story I wanted to sell or sensationalize. It was my life, my family's trauma, and we deserved privacy to heal. The public facts were in court records for anyone interested in the legal aspects, but the emotional reality of it belonged to us alone. Years later, Mark sent a letter through his lawyer requesting to see Ethan. By then, Ethan was 12 years old enough to make some decisions about his own relationship with his father. We discussed it extensively with his therapist, weighing the potential benefits and risks. Ethan decided he wasn't ready, might never be ready, and I supported that choice completely. Mark had made his decisions, and now he had to live with the consequences, including the loss of his son's presence in his life. Sometimes I think about the Mark I thought I knew, the man I fell in love with at 23, the father who seemed devoted to his son, the husband who remembered anniversaries and fixed things around the house. Was that person ever real, or was it always an act? I've come to believe it was probably both. People are complicated, capable of genuine love and terrible betrayal simultaneously. Mark probably did love Ethan in his own way, and maybe even loved me at some point, but he loved money and Jennifer more, enough to plan murder for them. Hit that subscribe button and help us grow. We're working toward 1,000 subscribers, and every new member helps us reach that goal. Subscribe now and be part of our story. The criminal justice system isn't perfect, and I know Mark's sentence won't undo the damage he caused or prevent every possible future crime. But seeing him held accountable, watching him face consequences for his actions, provided some sense of justice. He couldn't talk his way out of it, couldn't charm or manipulate his way to freedom. The evidence was too clear, the intent too obvious, the planning too detailed. Grandma Helen lived to see Ethan graduate from high school, which felt like a victory over everything Mark had tried to take from us. She was there in the audience, wearing a purple dress and crying happy tears, when Ethan walked across that stage to receive his diploma. She was there when he decided to pursue criminal justice at Michigan State University, following in Uncle Frank's footsteps. She was there for birthdays and holidays and ordinary Sunday dinners, present in a way Mark had tried to prevent. I eventually did date again, cautiously and slowly, learning to trust my instincts while accepting that you could never know someone completely. I met David at a work conference 3 years after Mark's trial. He was patient with my hesitations, understanding about my trust issues, and respectful of the boundaries I needed to maintain. We took things slowly, building friendship first, letting Ethan get to know him gradually. When David proposed 5 years after we first met, I said yes, finally ready to believe that not everyone would betray me. The wedding was small, just close family and friends, held in Grandma Helen's backyard on a warm June afternoon. She was 80 years old by then, moving slower but still sharp as ever, still telling stories and making everyone laugh. Ethan, now 15, walked me down the aisle, taking on the role his father should have filled. It felt right, having my son beside me, the person whose bravery and honesty had ultimately saved us all from a much darker timeline. Mark sent another letter when he heard about my remarriage, angry and possessive even from prison, claiming I was replacing him and trying to erase him from Ethan's life. I didn't respond. He'd erased himself through his own choices, and I owed him nothing. Not explanations, not justifications, not consideration of his feelings. He'd forfeited the right to my emotional energy when he plotted my grandmother's death. Subscribe to our channel and help us reach 1,000 subscribers. Your support means everything to this growing community. Click that subscribe button now and stay connected with us. Recovery from that kind of betrayal isn't linear. I still had bad days when the anger and hurt felt fresh, when I'd remember some moment from our marriage and wonder if it had been real or part of the deception. Therapy helped, time helped, building new happy memories helped. But I accepted that I'd probably always carry some scars from those years with Mark, some wariness about trusting too completely, some awareness that people could hide terrible things behind loving faces. Ethan turned out remarkably well-adjusted considering everything he'd been through. His childhood therapist said kids are resilient when they have strong support systems, and Ethan certainly had that. My mother, Grandma Helen, Uncle Frank, my new husband David, and countless other family members and friends surrounded him with love and stability. He knew what his father had done, understood the severity of those actions, but didn't let it define his entire childhood or his sense of self. When Ethan turned 18 and started college, he wrote Mark a letter. He didn't tell me about it beforehand, made the decision independently, which I respected. He later told me what he'd written, basically that he understood Mark was his biological father, that he didn't hate him, but that he also didn't want a relationship with someone who'd been willing to hurt people he loved for selfish gain. It was mature, measured, and final. Mark apparently responded with pages of excuses and self-justification, which Ethan read once and then filed away, drawing a mental line under that chapter of his life. Grandma Helen passed away peacefully in her sleep at age 82, surrounded by evidence of a life well-lived, photos covering every wall, crafts from grandchildren scattered around her room, a calendar full of activities and appointments she'd never make now. Her death was natural, expected even, not the violent end Mark had planned for her years earlier. We mourned her loss but celebrated her life, telling stories at her funeral about her strength, her humor, her resilience in the face of betrayal. In her will, she left a letter specifically for Ethan, thanking him for saving her life all those years ago, telling him how proud she was of the young man he'd become, encouraging him to use his experiences to help others. She left him her house, the same house where that fateful birthday party had taken place, where a 7-year-old boy had crawled under a table and changed everything. Ethan decided to keep it, eventually moving in during his sophomore year of college, creating new memories in rooms that had once been the setting for the worst day of our lives. If you've made it this far in the story, show your appreciation by subscribing. We're almost at 1,000 subscribers, and your click helps us reach that milestone. Join our community now by hitting that subscribe button. I think about that moment under the table a lot, how a child's innocent action revealed a monster hiding in plain sight. How different things could have been if Mark had been more careful with his phone, if Ethan had found a different toy to play with, if I dismissed my son's urgency as childish overreaction. The sliding doors of fate that led us to that specific outcome rather than countless darker alternatives haunted me sometimes. But mostly I felt grateful. Grateful for Ethan's sharp eyes and worried heart, for Uncle Frank's immediate action, for a justice system that took the threat seriously despite no actual harm having occurred yet. Grateful for my family's support, for therapy that helped us heal, for time that eventually made the pain less sharp. Grateful that Grandma Helen got 6 more years of life she might not have had, that she got to see Ethan grow from a scared 7-year-old to a confident teenager, that she got to die peacefully rather than violently. Mark became eligible for parole after serving 12 years of his 15-year sentence. The parole board held a hearing where they considered his behavior in prison, his remorse or lack thereof, the risk he might pose if released. I submitted a victim impact statement, as did my mother and uncle. Ethan, now 19 years old and studying criminal psychology, testified via video about how his father's actions had impacted his childhood and development. The board denied Mark's parole, determining he hadn't shown genuine remorse and still posed a potential threat. He'd serve his full sentence. Jennifer was released after serving 10 years, having earned time off for good behavior. I never had contact with her, and never wanted to. She moved to another state, took a job in a different field, tried to rebuild a life away from the scandal. I occasionally wondered if she thought about Grandma Helen, about the woman whose life she'd been willing to end for money and love, but mostly, I tried not to think about her at all. The experience changed my entire worldview. I became more cautious, but also more appreciative of genuine relationships. I valued honesty above almost everything else, could spot manipulation and lies more easily than before. I taught Ethan to trust his instincts, to speak up when something felt wrong, to never ignore that inner voice that says things aren't right. Those lessons, learned through trauma, became gifts that prepared him for a world where not everyone was trustworthy. David, my second husband, understood he was married to someone who'd been profoundly betrayed and adjusted his behavior accordingly. He was transparent about everything: his phone, his schedule, his friendships, his finances. He never gave me reason to doubt him, patiently rebuilding my ability to trust over years of consistent, honest behavior. He became a father figure to Ethan, not trying to replace Mark but offering guidance and support that a teenage boy desperately needed. We're so close to 1,000 subscribers. Help us reach that goal by clicking the subscribe button. Your support makes all the difference to our channel's growth. Subscribe now and be part of our community. Years later, when Ethan graduated from college with a degree in criminal justice, he gave a speech at a small family celebration. He talked about how a single moment of paying attention, of trusting his instincts as a child, had set him on a path toward helping others. He'd decided to become a detective specializing in financial crimes and elder abuse, directly inspired by what had happened to our family. He wanted to catch people like his father before they could hurt vulnerable victims, wanted to protect families from the kind of betrayal we'd experienced. I watched him speak, this confident young man who'd grown from that worried 7-year-old under the table, and felt overwhelming pride. Mark had tried to destroy our family for selfish gain, but in the end, his actions had created someone dedicated to stopping others like him. There was poetry in that, a kind of redemption that Mark himself would never achieve, but that his son embodied completely. Uncle Frank, retired officially but never really leaving police work behind, attended Ethan's graduation with tears in his eyes. He'd mentored my son throughout high school and college, sharing stories from his career, teaching him about investigation techniques, explaining how the criminal justice system worked. He told me once that seeing Ethan choose this path, turning his childhood trauma into purpose, was one of the proudest moments of his retirement. My relationship with David proved that not all men were like Mark, that trust could be rebuilt, that love didn't have to come with secret agendas and hidden betrayals. We built a life together based on transparency and mutual respect, showing Ethan through example what healthy relationships looked like. When David officially adopted Ethan at age 20, long after he was legally an adult, but as a symbolic gesture they both wanted, it felt like closing a door on Mark's influence and opening a new one to a different kind of family bond. Mark served his full 15-year sentence and was released when he was 53 years old. By then, he'd lost everything: his career, his reputation, his family, 15 years of his life. He tried to contact Ethan once after his release, but Ethan, now 22 and working as a junior detective in Detroit, declined to respond. The bridge between them had burned completely, destroyed by Mark's own choices that November day when he carelessly left his phone under a table at a birthday party. Sometimes I wonder what Mark thinks about now, whether he regrets his actions or just regrets getting caught. Whether he understands the magnitude of what he destroyed or still sees himself as a victim of circumstances. I'll probably never know, and honestly, I don't need to. His internal life, his justifications, his regrets or lack thereof, don't matter to my healing or Ethan's future. He's a cautionary tale, a reminder of how selfishness and greed can corrupt even seemingly normal people. Subscribe and help us hit that 1,000 subscriber milestone. We're building something special here, and you're an important part of it. Click that subscribe button now. Grandma Helen's legacy lived on through the trust fund she'd established, which eventually paid for Ethan's college education and helped him buy his first house. But more than the money, she left behind memories of resilience, of choosing joy despite betrayal, of living fully even when someone had tried to steal that life away. Every family dinner, every holiday, every Sunday afternoon visit she'd had after that birthday party felt like a victory, a middle finger to Mark's plans, proof that love and family loyalty were stronger than greed. The house where it all happened became a symbol of survival for our family. Ethan lived there through his 20s, eventually getting married himself and starting a family in those same rooms. His wife, Angela, knew the whole story and embraced the house's history rather than being frightened by it. They raised their children, my grandchildren, in that space, teaching them about bravery and honesty and standing up for what's right, using their grandfather's terrible choices as lessons in what not to become. I visited that house often, playing with my grandchildren in the same basement rec room where a 7-year-old Ethan had crawled under a table and found evidence that would change all our lives. The space had been redecorated, updated, transformed into a playroom full of toys and laughter, but I could still see the ghost of that afternoon superimposed on the present. Could still feel my heart stopping as I crouched down and saw that phone screen glowing in the darkness. Mark faded into obscurity after his release, just another middle-aged ex-con trying to rebuild a life with limited options and a criminal record. I heard through mutual acquaintances that he worked construction, lived in a small apartment, had no close relationships. Part of me felt satisfaction at his diminished circumstances, evidence that actions had consequences. Part of me felt nothing at all, too removed from who he'd been to care much about who he'd become. The revenge I'd once imagined, the anger that had burned so hot in those first months after the arrest, had cooled to a distant memory. I'd gotten the best revenge possible. A good life, a loving family, happiness that Mark would never touch or taint. He tried to destroy us for money and lust, and instead he destroyed only himself while we thrived. That was justice beyond anything the criminal system could provide. Ethan became known in his department for his dedication to elder abuse cases, bringing the same intensity to each investigation that someone might who'd almost lost their own grandmother to such a crime. He caught sophisticated scammers, exposed family members stealing from elderly relatives, built cases against predators who targeted vulnerable seniors. He told me once that every victim he helped felt like honoring Grandma Helen's memory, like making sure her near-miss served some greater purpose. We're working hard to reach 1,000 subscribers, and you can help by clicking that subscribe button. Join our growing community and stay connected with more stories. Subscribe now. Years turned into decades, and the story of that birthday party became family legend, told and retold to younger relatives who hadn't been there. It became a teaching moment about paying attention, about speaking up, about how children's instincts should be taken seriously. It became a reminder that evil could hide behind familiar faces, that vigilance and love were necessary partners in keeping families safe. I never remarried after David passed away from cancer when I was 62, having had 20 years of genuine love and partnership that proved not all endings were betrayals. I'd learned to be content alone, surrounded by family and friends, no longer needing a romantic partner to feel complete. Mark had stolen my first marriage through his deception, but he hadn't stolen my ability to love or be loved. That victory, that refusal to let his actions make me cynical and closed off, forever felt important. Ethan rose through the ranks of the Detroit Police Department, eventually becoming a lieutenant in the Financial Crimes Division by the time he turned 40. His reputation for thoroughness and empathy with elderly victims made him the go-to investigator for complex cases involving inheritance fraud and family manipulation. He gave lectures at the police academy about recognizing patterns of elder abuse, using sanitized versions of his own family history as case studies without revealing the personal connection. His students never knew that the passionate way he discussed these crimes came from lived experience, from being that 7-year-old who'd accidentally uncovered a murder plot. Make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss future stories. We're so close to 1,000 subscribers now, and your support helps us create more content. Hit that subscribe button and join us on this journey. I volunteered at a local organization that supported families dealing with criminal justice issues, helping people navigate the confusion and trauma that came with having a loved one arrested or convicted. My experience gave me unique insight into both sides. I was the victim whose life had been upended, but I was also technically the family member of an offender, having to explain to Ethan why his father was in prison, managing the social stigma that came with being associated with someone who'd planned murder. I could talk to people from a place of genuine understanding, without judgment, helping them find resources and emotional support. The organization asked me to speak at events sometimes, sharing my story with groups of survivors and families affected by crime. It was hard at first, making myself vulnerable in front of strangers, reliving those moments of discovery and betrayal. But I found it therapeutic, turning my pain into something useful, helping others feel less alone in their struggles. People would approach me afterward with tears in their eyes, thanking me for being honest about how messy and complicated these situations were, how recovery wasn't straightforward or simple. One woman told me that my story gave her courage to report her own husband, who'd been financially abusing his mother and moving money from her accounts into his own. She'd been afraid to act, worried about destroying her family, but hearing how I'd handled a similar situation convinced her that protecting vulnerable people was worth the personal cost. She thanked me through tears, and I thought about how Mark's terrible choices had somehow, circuitously, led to protecting other elderly people from harm. It didn't excuse what he'd done, but it gave his actions an unintended positive consequence he'd never anticipated. Ethan's oldest daughter, my granddaughter Claire, showed early signs of the same intuitive awareness that had saved Grandma Helen. She noticed things other kids missed, picked up on adult conversations that revealed problems, asked questions that cut straight to the heart of issues people were trying to hide. Ethan and Angela nurtured this quality rather than discouraging it, teaching her to trust those instincts while also maintaining appropriate boundaries. She reminded me so much of young Ethan, that same worried look in her eyes when something felt wrong, that same determination to make things right. When Claire was 10, she noticed her teacher seemed increasingly exhausted and defeated at school. While other kids just accepted that adults sometimes seemed tired, Claire paid attention to details. The long sleeves her teacher wore even in warm weather, the flinching when someone approached too quickly, the sad resignation in her voice when she talked about going home. Claire mentioned it to her parents, who took her seriously because they understood that children's observations shouldn't be dismissed. Ethan quietly made inquiries and discovered the teacher was indeed in an abusive relationship. With appropriate intervention from professionals, they were able to help connect her with resources to safely leave. Claire's awareness had potentially saved another life, continuing a family legacy of paying attention and speaking up. Subscribe if you haven't already. Your support means we can keep sharing these important stories. We're building toward 1,000 subscribers, and you can help us get there. Click that subscribe button now. I thought often about that sliding door moment, how everything hinged on Ethan dropping a toy car and crawling under that table at exactly the right time. If he'd been playing somewhere else, if the party had been structured differently, if Mark had been more careful with his phone, everything could have gone differently. Grandma Helen might have died under mysterious circumstances. Police might have investigated, but found nothing conclusive. Mark and Jennifer might have gotten away with it, started their new life together built on blood, money, and murder. But that's not what happened. Instead, a child's innocent action exposed evil hiding in plain sight. A family rallied to protect one of their own. Law enforcement took the threat seriously and built a case. Justice was served, imperfectly but meaningfully. And life continued, scarred but not destroyed, carrying lessons that would ripple forward through generations. Mark sent one final letter when I turned 65, apparently having kept track of my life despite having no real part in it. The letter was short, just a few lines saying he'd had years to think about his choices and wanted me to know he was sorry for the pain he'd caused. He didn't ask for forgiveness or reconciliation, didn't make excuses or try to minimize his actions, just expressed regret and wished me well. I read it once, then filed it away without responding. His remorse, if genuine, was his burden to carry. I didn't need to absolve him or acknowledge his apology to move forward with my life. Ethan was more conflicted when I mentioned the letter to him. He thought he'd made peace with having a father who'd planned murder, but hearing about this late-life contrition stirred up complicated feelings. We talked about it over coffee at the house that had once been Grandma Helen's, surrounded by his children's toys and artwork, life continuing in spaces where death had once been plotted. He decided not to respond either, maintaining the boundary he'd established years earlier. Mark's redemption, if he'd truly found it, would have to be its own reward. We didn't owe him participation in his healing process. Angela, Ethan's wife, once asked me if I'd ever forgiven Mark. I thought about it for a long time before answering. I'd let go of the burning anger, the desire for revenge, the obsessive replaying of our marriage looking for clues I'd missed. I'd built a good life that had nothing to do with him. But forgiveness felt like a gift he hadn't earned and didn't deserve. I'd moved on, which was different from forgiving. I'd healed, which didn't require absolving him. I told Angela that maybe some things didn't need to be forgiven, just accepted as part of your history and integrated into who you became. Join our community by subscribing. We're almost at our goal of 1,000 subscribers, and every new member helps us reach that milestone. Click that subscribe button and stay connected. The anniversary of Grandma Helen's 75th birthday became a family tradition, a day we marked not with sadness, but with celebration. We'd gather at the house, now Ethan's home, and tell stories about her, about that fateful party, about how close we'd come to losing her years before we actually did. We'd toast to her memory, to Ethan's bravery, to Uncle Frank's quick action, to the entire chain of events that had saved her life and exposed Mark's true nature. It became a celebration of family loyalty, of paying attention, of having the courage to act when something felt wrong. Claire grew up hearing these stories, understanding from a young age that heroes weren't just people in comic books but ordinary family members who did the right thing when it mattered. She idolized her grandfather Ethan, not knowing him as the worried 7-year-old he'd been but seeing him as the confident detective he'd become. She'd announced at age 12 that she wanted to follow in his footsteps, protecting people who couldn't protect themselves, catching bad guys before they could hurt innocent people. I worried sometimes that our family had been too shaped by trauma, that we'd made Mark's betrayal too central to our identity. But Ethan's therapist, who I'd consulted about this concern, reassured me that we'd done something healthy by transforming pain into purpose, by using our experience to help others, by refusing to let Mark's actions define us negatively. We'd taken something terrible and made it meaningful, which was a sign of resilience, not dysfunction. Uncle Frank passed away peacefully at 87, surrounded by family, having lived to see Ethan become a decorated police lieutenant and Claire announce her intention to join the police academy. His funeral was attended by hundreds of former colleagues and people he'd helped over his long career. Ethan gave the eulogy, talking about how Frank had been a father figure who taught him the meaning of justice, integrity, and protecting those who couldn't protect themselves. He didn't mention that specific November afternoon, but everyone in our family knew that Frank's quick action that day had set so much in motion. The house continued to hold memories, layers upon layers of them now. The basement rec room where a birthday party had hidden a murder plot was where Claire and her siblings played video games and hosted sleepovers. The driveway where I'd sat in the car, frantically backing up evidence, was where Ethan taught his kids to ride bikes. The kitchen where I'd stood at the sink, trying to act normal while my world crumbled, was where Angela baked cookies with grandchildren who would never know the dark history those walls had witnessed. Subscribe now if you're enjoying this story. Your support helps us grow and reach more people. We're working toward 1,000 subscribers, and you're an essential part of that goal. Hit that subscribe button. I dated occasionally in my 70s, finding companionship without needing the intensity of marriage. I'd learned to be happy alone, to find fulfillment in my volunteer work, my grandchildren, my friends, my own interests and hobbies. Mark had tried to steal my future along with Grandma Helen's life, but I'd built a future anyway, one he couldn't touch or diminish. That felt like the ultimate victory. Mark died at 68 of a heart attack, alone in his apartment, found by a neighbor who noticed his mail piling up. Ethan was notified as next of kin, having never changed the emergency contact information despite their estrangement. He arranged for a simple cremation but didn't attend any service. When he told me about Mark's death, I felt nothing much at all, just a distant acknowledgement that a chapter had finally closed completely. I didn't tell Ethan how to feel about losing his father, didn't push him toward grief or relief. He processed it in his own way, with his therapist, and moved forward. Claire graduated from the police academy at 22, third in her class, with Ethan beaming in the audience. She'd chosen to specialize in crimes against children and elderly people, continuing the family tradition of protecting vulnerable populations. Her training officers noted her unusual empathy and attention to detail, qualities that would serve her well in investigations. She had a gift for interviewing victims, making them feel heard and believed, probably because she'd grown up hearing stories about how important it was to listen when someone said something was wrong. Jennifer, Mark's former accomplice and lover, also died sometime in her 60s. I only learned about it through an online obituary search I did occasionally, out of morbid curiosity. She'd apparently never married, never had children, lived a quiet, anonymous life in Arizona until cancer took her. Her obituary was brief, listing no survivors, no accomplishments, no legacy beyond a few words acknowledging her existence. It seemed a lonely ending for someone who'd once been willing to commit murder for love and money, who'd thrown away any chance at genuine connection for a fantasy that crumbled under the first scrutiny. I sometimes wondered what would have happened if Jennifer and Mark had actually succeeded, if they'd somehow managed to stress Grandma Helen into a fatal heart attack, collected the inheritance, and started their dream life together. Would guilt have destroyed their relationship? Would they have been able to live with what they'd done? Or would they have rationalized it, convinced themselves Helen was old anyway, would have died soon regardless, that they'd simply accelerated the inevitable? I'd never know, and I was grateful for that ignorance. If you found value in this story, show your support by subscribing. We're building a community focused on real experiences and meaningful content. Help us reach 1,000 subscribers by clicking that subscribe button now. Ethan retired from the police force at 55, having served for over 30 years. His retirement party was attended by dozens of people he'd helped over the years, elderly victims whose cases he'd solved, fellow officers he'd mentored, family members of victims who'd found justice through his work. Speaker after speaker talked about his dedication, his compassion, his integrity. I sat in the back of the room crying happy tears, thinking about that scared 7-year-old under the table who'd grown into this man who'd made protecting others his life's work. In retirement, Ethan wrote a book about elder abuse and financial exploitation, using case studies from his career and, with my permission, finally telling the full story of what had happened with Mark and Grandma Helen. The book became required reading in some criminal justice programs, praised for its insight into the psychology of family crimes and the importance of taking threats seriously even before physical harm occurred. Ethan donated all proceeds to organizations supporting elderly abuse victims, turning our family's pain into resources for others. I lived to see my great-grandchildren born, Claire's children who would grow up 3 generations removed from that November afternoon, but still shaped by its legacy. They'd learn to pay attention, to trust their instincts, to speak up when something felt wrong. They'd understand that ordinary people could do extraordinary things, that evil sometimes wore familiar faces, that courage wasn't the absence of fear, but acting despite it. The house eventually passed to Claire when Ethan and Angela decided to downsize. She and her husband renovated it extensively, updating systems and finishes, but kept the basic structure and layout. The basement rec room remained, now hosting a 4th generation of family gatherings. When Claire's daughter turned 7, the same age Ethan had been during that fateful party, Claire told her the story of what had happened in that very room, age-appropriate details about how her great-grandfather had saved her great-great-great-grandmother by noticing something wrong and telling a trusted adult. I died at 86, peacefully in my sleep like Grandma Helen had, surrounded by evidence of a life well-lived despite the betrayal that could have destroyed it. My obituary listed my children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren, my volunteer work, my late husband David, my years of helping other families navigate criminal justice trauma. It mentioned in passing that I was predeceased by my first husband Mark, without details, just acknowledging his existence as part of my history without giving him space he didn't deserve. Subscribe to support this channel and be part of our community. We're so close to 1,000 subscribers, and your click makes a real difference. Hit that subscribe button and join us now. At my funeral, Ethan told the story one more time, how a 7-year-old's observation had changed everything, how his mother, me, had been brave enough to act on that information despite it destroying her marriage, how Grandma Helen had gotten 6 extra years of life because people paid attention and took threats seriously. He talked about how I'd turned that trauma into purpose, helping others, showing him through example that suffering could be transformed into meaning if you were willing to do the work. Claire spoke too, talking about growing up with this story as part of her family legend, how it had shaped her career choice and her parenting, how she taught her own children to be observant and brave like their great-grandfather had been. She held up a photo of young Ethan from around the time of that birthday party, a grinning 7-year-old missing his front teeth, innocent and unaware that he'd soon accidentally become a hero. She said that every time she investigated a case or interviewed a witness, she thought about that photo, about how ordinary people doing ordinary things could accidentally save lives. The family gathered afterward at the house, the same house where it had all happened, now almost 50 years later. They ate food and told stories and laughed and cried, celebrating my life, while acknowledging how one terrible moment had shaped all of their existences in ways both large and small. Mark's name came up once, briefly, not with anger but with something more like pity for a man who'd had so much and thrown it all away for greed and lust, who died alone and unmourned while his intended victim had lived another decade, surrounded by love. And life continued as it always does. Claire's children grew up in that house, playing in rooms with dark histories they'd learn about eventually. Ethan's book was assigned in college courses, helping new generations of criminal justice students understand the complexity of family crimes. The trust fund Grandma Helen had established continued supporting descendants' education and helping fund elder abuse prevention organizations. Mark's attempt to steal and destroy had instead created ripples of protection and awareness that extended far beyond our family. The story of that November afternoon became something bigger than just our family drama. It was used in police training as an example of why you listen to children, why you take threats seriously even before violence occurs, why documentation and evidence matter. It was cited in academic papers about elder abuse and financial exploitation. It appeared in true crime podcasts as an example of attempted murder stopped before anyone died. Mark had wanted to be remembered as successful and wealthy. Instead, he became a cautionary tale, his name associated with greed and betrayal and failed schemes. Please subscribe if you haven't already. We're working hard to build this community, and you're an important part of reaching our goal of 1,000 subscribers. Click that subscribe button now. But for our family, it was always more personal than a case study or cautionary tale. It was about Grandma Helen's laugh, about Ethan's worried face, about my moment of choice between protecting my marriage and protecting my family, about Uncle Frank's immediate action, about all the small decisions that added up to justice and survival. It was about how betrayal doesn't have to be the end of the story, how families can heal from even the deepest wounds if they support each other with honesty and love. The house still stands, still occupied by family, still holding its secrets in the walls and floorboards. Visitors who don't know the history see just another lovely suburban home, well-maintained and full of life. But those who know look at the basement rec room differently, imagining a birthday party decades ago, a 7-year-old crawling under a table, a phone screen glowing with evidence of murder, a mother making the hardest decision of her life, an entire family changed forever in the space of a few hours. And sometimes, late at night when the house is quiet, Claire sits in that basement and thinks about the weight of family history, about the responsibility of carrying these stories forward, about teaching her children to be brave and observant and willing to act when something feels wrong. She thinks about her grandfather Ethan, that scared little boy who trusted his instincts and told the truth even though he didn't fully understand the consequences. She thinks about his mother, her grandmother, who'd chosen justice over comfort, protecting family over protecting her marriage. She thinks about Grandma Helen, who'd lived 6 extra years because people loved her enough to act. And she makes a promise to herself and to the generations that will come after that she'll teach them all to pay attention, to speak up, to never ignore that feeling when something's wrong, to understand that ordinary people in ordinary moments can prevent extraordinary tragedy just by being brave enough to act on what they know is right. The story ends where it began, in that basement rec room, but now decades later, full of different people, different toys, different laughter, transformed from a place where murder was plotted to a place where life continues, where children play, where family gathers, where the past is remembered but doesn't define the present, where an old man's greed was defeated by a child's instinct and a mother's courage, where every birthday party since carries echoes of that one fateful celebration when everything changed but nothing was destroyed because one person, one child, decided to say those simple words, "Mom, look under the table now." I saved Grandma's life, and all I got was a front row seat to watch my father's entire existence crumble. Turns out being a good kid has its perks.